many Canadians, as synonymous with Remembrance Day as poppies themselves. The first stanza serves to set the scene of the field, filled with white crosses, marking the graves of the dead interspersed with bright red poppies. The mind of the reader is first exposed to a quiet scene wherein the poppies blow between the crosses row on row. Suddenly, the narrators are exposed as the dead, the fallen soldiers buried there in Flanders Fields, underneath those crosses. By the fifth line, we are told that the battle is still raging there, by the graves of those fallen soldiers. The second stanza serves to personify those soldiers, the dead. This personification resonates with the reader. The dead are just like me. I live, feel dawn, see sunset glow, love, I'm loved. Just like them. I could just as easily lie in Flanders Fields, or, in a more modern example, Iraq or Afghanistan. This second stanza sets the stage for the final stanza. It creates empathy on the part of the reader for the dead. It's also quite relevant, even in today's wars, because we have soldiers dying over in Afghanistan. In the case of the States, they're in Iraq, they're in all over the place, really. And this poem, it makes you feel for those soldiers regardless of how you actually feel about war, which is, that's pretty hard to do. The third and final stanza is the most compelling. It's an admonishment and a cry for faith and remembrance that strikes the core of everyone who hears it. The admonishment is on the part of the dead, and it's to keep fighting and to take up our quarrel with the foe. The acknowledgement of failure and thus humanity is a powerful idea born out of the third stanza. The mere description of the failing hands, it rips apart your soul as you hear, you can't help but picture these men dying and saying, keep fighting, just keep fighting, and we won't have died for nothing. And this is followed, by an appeal to the reader's patriotism, their loyalty, their sense of duty. The soldiers are throwing from their failing hands the torch, and as they say, it's yours to hold it high, and that if you break faith with us, the dead who die, we shall not sleep, though poppies grow in Flanders Field. Meaning that if you let us down, we won't ever be able to sleep peacefully for eternity as we should, because we need you to keep fighting. And that's a reoccurring thing. You should keep fighting. You should keep fighting. And, that's sort of like, I see the torch as a symbol of democracy and the right to be free, because that's what these men felt that they were fighting for. And it's a really strong feeling to put into a poem, because when you think about it, okay, they're saying protect democracy, protect the right to be free. You keep fighting for that, and that's something I think that everyone could pretty much agree on, particularly in the time period outside of the USSR. And even then, they could probably change that to say, "Hey, fight for communism." But the appeal to duty, is strong, especially if you're looking at the First World War. The idea of duty is very ingrained within the society, particularly English society, which was what Canada was based on. And so, it's this appeal that the soldiers are making. It really helps, it makes you think that, if only they know that there's someone who's going to take up their fight, to take up and take their place, and they're going to keep fighting, that these poor guys will be able to rest, okay? And in the largest sense, the poem is meant to be patriotic and motivational. It has little to do with the actual aspects of war. It's more of a pastoral image. And this is evidenced in John McCrae's own letters to his mother, written from 1915 to 1918. His mom was back in Guelph, and he was detailing what was going on over in the Battle of Ypres. McCrae details the debacle of the French stragglers meeting them as they traveled towards the Battle of Ypres on Friday, April 23rd, 1915. And the mere description of them as stragglers is, it kind of gives way to that idea of the idealized picture of the neat white crosses compared to this straggling group of French soldiers. It really makes you think. And the straggling soldiers, as John McCrae points out, are full of disheartening tales and information for the poor guys who are heading up into battle, which couldn't have been very good for them and their morale. However, McCrae describes the courage of the men that he was with by calling them splendid, and the actual battle itself as a terrific test. Still, he can't quite get away from the realistic images and the war-torn area. He describes his feelings of the asphyxiated French soldiers, which is quite graphic, particularly for a letter you're writing home to your mother, and then of the women and children and their fates on the battlefield. And it doesn't fit with his pastoral images in the first stanza and the cleaned up depiction of war that he presents. And the other thing is he describes the death of a lieutenant at his guns on May 2nd, 1915, and how he barely even had time to pray over him and give him, whatever last rites he could on the battlefield. And you can't help but wonder if that lieutenant was part of his inspiration for the actual poem. Was that one of the dead that he was thinking of who couldn't sleep, who needed that assurance that people would keep fighting? One of the most interesting things about McCrae's poem is that, like myself, many people don't actually learn it through the text. According to Sir Andrew MacPhail, McCrae's former editor, the poem circulates as a song should circulate, by the living word of mouth, not by the printed characters. So rather he compares it to a song, not so much just a poem that we usually see in text. And I totally agree with that. I find it hard to recite In Flanders Fields, as I'm sure you found in the audio. I was much more comfortable singing it. And for me, the poem is really a living piece of poetry that doesn't require the reader to see the text, but is actually more important to be heard. And that's where you get the real meaning of the text. And the images within the text actually speak to that verbal power. The crosses row on row fill our minds with images of tiny white crosses in neat little rows in a field, while the larks, the birds of morning, and thus hope, sing bravely over the guns of the battlefield. The symbol of pasteurized death, combined with the symbol of mourning and hope, juxtaposed against the image of battle and bloody death, is conveyed much better verbally than through simply viewing the text. You even get a better sense of it if you read it aloud rather than simply reading it. The images of dawn and sunset that follow bring back the neat, simple, light images of the first two lines. Again, we are then confronted with hard images of quarreling and a torch to be lit forevermore, much like the spirit of democracy. This torch, this passing of responsibility and hope for the world, comes through in each reading of the poem. One cannot help but put emphasis on the final stanza more than anywhere else in the poem. However, of course, there can actually be problems with transmitting the text orally. For many years, I actually thought that the final line of the first stanza was part of the second stanza. Thus, my reading was a little off in that I thought the dead were scarcely heard amid the guns below, instead of the larks, which actually makes rather more sense, but, that sort of thing happens. As you can see, that would really skew the idea of it. Other inconsistencies were the misreading of failing as flailing, and the introduction of the word grow in place of the word blow in the final stanza. I still have problems getting that one straight. In the case of In Flanders Fields, the text has been preserved as a sort of national icon along with the verbal version, so it's been allowed to survive since the First World War, which has made it, a much more